Hello and welcome back to PA Truck Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Tim. Hi Tim, how are we doing?
Doing well, doing well. Thanks for having me.
If you give us a little background onto how you got started in S&C and uh, how your career sort of progressed from there.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to close the door a little bit. Yeah, so as most of us did, we were involved in sport in some way, shape, or form, typically playing something. And, I was never the biggest guy or the most talented person on the team that I'd be playing on or in anything that we were doing. So I always kind of had to find different ways to become better. And that kind of led me to the training side of things. And I think about it now, going back and looking at I'll put in quotes, programming that I did for myself. I'd take the 17, 18-year-old version of those programs and just kind of punch myself in the face, because I think about what I did and how limited and not applicable it actually was. I came up in the school of, you're doing sets of 10. You're doing sets of 10 of everything. That kind of led me to doing a degree in kinesiology, and there was an emphasis in strength and conditioning for that. And so I took that route, and that was that's turned into an internship that was doing strength and conditioning research, and that kind of laid the foundation for where I went from there. So I did a master's degree in human performance, and I did a thesis project that was focused on weightlifting movements and variations of weightlifting movements, which I've continued that research ever since. But I also was I was able to coach while I was doing my master's degree, which was helpful because you get the applied side and you get the research side as well. And then on top of that, I decided that I wanted to be in a situation that I was able to research what I wanted to research, and being able to go do a PhD under Mike Stone at East Tennessee State. Part of that program is you were actually functioning as a strength and conditioning coach for one of the teams. And on top of that, from more the data analytics or the testing side of things, we were also collecting data with all of our teams and using those in data returns and being able to drive decision making. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to be in situations that I've been able to be on the research side as well as the applied side at the same time. And I think that's certainly shaped my views in terms of how we can use specific methods in essence.
So going from the practical to the research, how did the use of one better the other in relation to your skill set and the output you're able to do from then on?
So, I've told people this more and more, that I probably get more ideas from a research standpoint being in a weight room than I do just sitting in a lab. So I think the applied side was really important. And from that spurred several different research projects, and then being able to make that information actionable through research has been the primary focus. So with that in mind, I'll just give you an example. If I were to ask, a American football coach and say, do your athletes have to be powerful? They'll say yes. And then I'll ask the question, when do they need to be powerful? Now, if you have a coach that understands kind of underlying basic physiology and things like that, they'll tell you that, they have to be at peak performance during the season, versus some of the other ones will tell you, hey, we need to be at peak power all year round, which we know from physiological standpoint that's not really possible. So that kind of led me to the idea of what different methods of training can we use to benefit the underlying strength characteristics that are going to benefit these types of individuals down the line. So the primary example that I'll use is with the weightlifting movements that I mentioned previously. We started to find, as well as Paul Comfort started to find, that pulling variations, we can actually create a pretty good stimulus, and similar if not greater compared to some of the catching variations. So this has led to additional training studies on that front, if we load them the same, if we don't load them the same. So the output obviously will never be as fast as we want it to be, because research takes time. But at the same time, we feel that we've certainly been able to create some actionable information that at least allows gives strength and conditioning coaches more tools in the toolbox than just simply, this is what we've always done and that's what we're going to continue to do.
That's a good point. It's something that is often spoke about in the industry, and it's that research is always behind, and what can we do to help it catch up? I don't think there's a real answer because, again, I mentioned this in the lobby. Mike Stone, one thing that he said on the podcast was like, we still don't know if one principle is effective 100% of the time. They're like mostly works, but like there is some situations where it might not. So if you've got injuries, illnesses, then you have to take a step back and reevaluate what you do. In your point of view, what can be done to sort of narrow a little bit more that time between research being done and us applying it in a coaching sense? This is a quick shout out to our main sponsor on this channel, TeamBuilder. TeamBuilder is an all-in-one platform that hosts programs, questionnaires, testing, anything that you may need for your athlete's performance, you can host it in TeamBuilder. TeamBuilder also now has 2 different sides, which is OS and Practice. For more information on TeamBuilder, check out the link in the description. And if you use code PACHOCKUP all together, you will get a 30-day free trial.
And honestly, I think what it becomes is that the weight room becomes the lab. And what I mean by that is it's real-time monitoring using these different types of methods. Because we were taught at East Tennessee, and I still believe in this, that a good strength and conditioning coach should also be a good sports scientist in the sense that they understand the data that they get on a daily basis, whether that is, sets, reps, load, as simple as that, or if you're actually using the additional testing to kind of determine if adaptations are occurring the way that you would like them to occur. So, with that being said, it may not necessarily be a formal research project, but every single day that athletes are in the weight room using specific training methods, we are under the assumption that they are going to adapt a specific way. We program based on theory, but if we start to understand that each individual needs, development in specific areas, then we can certainly use some research to guide that, but just know that it may not necessarily be a formal research project until someone were to write it up retrospectively. So I think part of it is good collaboration with call it the academic side and the athletic side, or like I said, if you have a good strength and conditioning coach who understands the existing literature and is able to be very forward thinking and say, hey, what happened is, even if it's in the off season where we know that we're trying to maximize certain adaptations, you probably wouldn't be doing much of this in season anyway, but if you really wanted to compare the impacts, the farthest away from the season would be beneficial. So we can certainly see some of these things real time from a monitoring standpoint. And obviously there's a variety of tools that exist in terms of, I'm just giving an example of tracking velocity of a specific repetition. So not to say that that's the be-all end-all, because it's certainly not, but there are different ways that we can monitor some of these things real time. Another example I'll give you is like Marquette University with Christoph Kipp. Their weight room has specific platforms that actually have force plates embedded within them. Why that's beneficial is real time. You can say, well, let's do a variation of an exercise this way on the force plate and see what we get, and then we'll do another variation the same day, and you can see real time kind of what type of training stimulus that the individual can get. And maybe it's different from one person to another. So being able to have those tools readily available will certainly make things real time in terms of adjusting.
Yeah. And again, we're talking about like AMS systems, how to keep track of all the data and how the athletes feel externally and internally. I know Pitt has a lot of current work with TeamBuilder and how that systems are all being played out. How has something like TeamBuilder sort of helped the development of this research and the real life adaptation to what is happening in front of you?
Yeah, I think something like Team Builder, you obviously have the built-in monitoring, for lack of a better term, in terms of sets, reps, the workouts and everything, and we can start to see some of those additional adaptations on top of what we have. I do think something like that and being able to structure workouts and have the opportunity to modify exercise choices and things like that real time is certainly beneficial as well, versus having your hard copy sheets of paper. I know some people are very hell-bent on keeping it that way, and there's nothing wrong with that, but obviously being able to adjust on the fly is pretty important. And then obviously going back and looking at previous workouts completed by individuals is certainly going to be beneficial as well.
Yeah. What is currently really firing you up in research, either that you're doing or that you're seeing coming out?
There's several things, and there's never enough time to write what I want to write. There's certainly been a growing body of literature on accentuated eccentric loading that's exciting, just because we're finding out that there are more groups within the world, I can say, that are actually doing some of this research, and it'll certainly help us build some of our research questions as well. I do think that there's more of a push to really understand the validity, reliability, etc. of how we can use things like velocity-based training. Not to say that many people took it at face value at first, but I think that's kind of what happened, is it's that, we're chasing a velocity and this is what we should only chase, when in reality, we need to understand what we're looking at. And what I mean by that is, I was just at a conference, a couple weekends ago with Brian Mann, and we had this exact same conversation. Brian will be the first person to tell you that using VBT as like a primary programming method for individuals is certainly going to be a moderate to advanced athlete tool. This isn't necessarily something that needs to be implemented. Brian has been quoted as saying it's something you get to use, not something you have to use. And the reality is we want to make sure technique is solidified, but going back on the route of what the velocity actually represents, we have to understand that we're looking at a barbell velocity, but the barbell velocity, in my view, is certainly an output of what has been done at the system level, or what the individual actually created. So when we have movements like a bench press, a squat, a deadlift, where there's traditionally a bar path, and in the case of a squat, you have the bar in contact with the body, so in theory the body's moving the exact same velocity, et cetera, et cetera. But, Jeff McBride did some work on this in the past, and I know we've done some work on this as well, and highlighting the fact that, barbell velocity and center of mass velocity with the weightlifting movements are not the same, because the barbell travels independently from the body. So as a result, in terms of understanding what we're actually monitoring, it's really important to understand, are we looking at the output, and does it relate directly to what the individual did, or are we seeing a one-in-one? And what I mean by that is, if the velocity is high, was the individual actually moving well, or is it just a byproduct of how far the bar moved? And the paper that we published on the weightlifting movements really highlighted this with an exercise like the high pull. Now, the high pull is I'll call it a semi-ballistic movement, because we generally don't leave the ground, but the bar is propelled, with a fast velocity, and with that kind of ballistic intent, versus something like a jump shrug is actually a ballistic movement, but it has a smaller displacement. So if you actually go and look at the two different exercises, you could get the exact same velocity, at 20% of someone's hang power clean max, but the peak velocity is generated differently. It's either a high displacement or it's actually a ballistic movement. So if you go and actually look at the center of mass, it's completely different. So again, within that, what kind of gets me thinking about that is, are we actually monitoring the right things? When it comes to VBT, that's obviously a bigger question, because I think it's very exercise and individual dependent. And I suppose the last thing is kind of the the overall concept of force velocity profiling. In my opinion, I think that some of the tools that are out there can be beneficial when it comes to force velocity profiling. Field-based methods are obviously something that's been investigated by those like Pierre Samazino, J.B. Marin, but I'd also question some of it in terms of, are we truly looking at the force production characteristics of the individual, or are we estimating them? Because if we have the tools available to us, like a force plate, and then we just use the jump height from the force plate and then estimate the force production characteristics, what's the point in even using the force plate, you know? But I would also say that there's a lack of research that's actually looked at the concentric qualities, the isometric qualities, and the braking or eccentric qualities overall. So there really hasn't been anything out there that's looked at the overall profile of the individual and kind of within context what that actually means for each task.
I think this is a really good
I know that was a very long-winded answer.
No, it's all good. There's a lot that I took from it, and me and Paul Comfort were at the UKSCA event this year as well, and we go into a conversation on what is the national standards, right? So if we pick a American football, say, they'll have like the national standards for where your athlete should be depending on the seasons, right? Paul broke it down like brilliantly, and he was like, well, what are standards? That's just the average. Like, from this position, that's your average metric. Sure, if you're not at the standard, you're below it, yeah, match it. But if you are already there, you're just average between the whole nation. So, like, what do we do? Do we stay there, or do we keep going to try and progress and make yourselves better? And I think it was a very simple observation, but it's something that happens a lot, and it's when we're being measured too by the average. It's not like individuals, it's not specific. It's just like, from an average standpoint, this is what people should be at. If you're there, great, cool, let's stay there. And not have that drive to be like, okay, yeah, I'm at the standard, but it's not good enough. Like, let's push it to the next level.
No, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think the biggest issue that we have when it comes to the standards is oftentimes we don't actually know what is good, what is average, what is poor. And it seems so simplistic, but the reality is we're not benchmarking enough. And let me rephrase that. We're also not benchmarking enough with a variety of tests. The reality is, a lot of people will do counter movement jump testing. There's nothing wrong with counter movement jump testing, but the reality is it's a very, very general test that's very simplistic to use, and that's probably why everyone uses it. But to be able to break down what makes a counter movement jump successful is really important, because oftentimes you get individuals, and thankfully there's been a kind of a trend away from this, and at least in my opinion, where we're only looking at a jump height. It's like, okay, you get a jump height. What does that mean? It's like, it's an output. So it's similar to what we were talking about with VBT. It's like, okay, you have an output, but how did you actually achieve that? And I think there's been kind of a push, and Paul and John McMahon and Jason Lake, all those individuals who've been involved with different force plate companies and things like that have certainly pushed the idea of that, okay, an output's great, but figuring out how the individual actually achieves it is probably more important than anything else. Because the reality is, let's just say, for example, that you and I are going to do a counter movement jump test, and both of us jump, or let's just say you jump, I'll make this up, you jump 40 centimeters in a counter movement jump, and I jump 30. Well, if the task in the sport only requires us to jump 30 or 20 or something lower than that, but I get off the ground considerably faster than you do, it doesn't matter what my jump height is, and it doesn't matter what your jump height is, because we're both going to get to it. But if I get to it faster, I win the task. And that's what I think is missed when it comes to some of the testing. Because it's like, okay, you improve your jump height. Well, why did you improve your jump height? Did you develop better braking qualities? Were you able to transition better from braking to propulsion? Oftentimes, I hate to be a generalist, but individuals who just get generally stronger during certain movements, you can get a transfer effect that comes over. I talked about this at my presentation at ICST, the pre-conference, where strength is task specific. So how our force production characteristics are going to be very specific to what we're doing, not only from a magnitude standpoint, but from a duration. If we talk about a sprint, you're only on the ground, at least at the elite level, something like 90 milliseconds. So if you're only on the ground that long, you have an incredibly short time to produce force and produce a lot of it. Versus a counter movement jump, comparatively speaking, is incredibly slow compared to a ground contact in a sprint. So again, I think we're getting away from the outputs a little bit more, but I also think, as per our conversation, I think there needs to be more benchmarking of the underlying characteristics rather than just the output characteristics.
Yeah, and I've got 2 points on that. And it's something that I think it's something that doesn't get touched on enough. But one of it is it's a jump performance. It is an output. What does it mean? Like with, say, Hawking Dynamics, you get so many metrics from it. Like, is all of it important? Like, should you keep a track of it? Or do we keep a track of one or two and make it really specific to what our phase is? But then that requires you to understand exactly what's happening at each level of it. Like, if I'm wanting my athletes to be more powerful, the short stretch cycle is important. Like, I need it to be fast. I need it to be reactive. But if I'm wanting them to maintain and just, build the armor, am I look at stabilizing? How long does it take to stabilize? Like, right. And it's understanding that these metrics can and should change during the season. Like, in preseason, your jump height might not be the best. Like, it just might not. But it's good to keep a track of it, just to see, okay,
oh yeah,
we can push, we can really see what's happening. But like, there's some points in the preseason where you're going to just hate moving because it hurts.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, I'm not discounting, and I don't think you are either. I don't think we're discounting the importance of output metrics, but the fact of the matter is a basketball player and a volleyball player have to be able to jump really high. It's beneficial within their sport to be able to do that. But again, we have to look at it from a progression standpoint, is that, okay, maybe, they've achieved this jump height, and not to say that it's their ceiling, no pun intended, but if we are able to improve the jump height, great. But if we are able to maintain the jump height and have them get to it faster, then that's also beneficial. So again, there becomes different metrics that we may consider looking at. But again, you mentioned the fact of like a stretch shortening cycle. And I think there's been more of a push within the literature to kind of highlight that we are expressing force differently when it comes to certain tests, when it comes to certain tasks. So, there may be the need to be able to assess an individual within different tasks to make sure that they are expressing force the way that we want them to.
Yeah, I think as well, it's, again, to use your same pun, but it's understanding the ceiling. Like, yes, we can do some work to improve it or improve metrics around it. But at the very elite level, having a 0.01% increase in performance, that's major. Like, if you have a newbie and they jump 30, the week 2 they jump 35, week 3 they jump 40, sick, your program works. But how much can we actually accredit that to just newbie gains? Right?
100%. I think, as you mentioned, at kind of the elite level, we're chasing fractions of a percentage in terms of improvement. But at that level, any improvement is a positive improvement, and could be potentially substantial, considering at the elite level some of those events that are timed events are, we'll take the 100 meters, for example. We're talking fractions of a second and, down to milliseconds sometimes, and when these are actually determined, or in terms of who wins and who loses.
My second point to what we've just been speaking about is Brian Mann was recently on the podcast, and we kind of spoke about the VBT. And now, anyone that's asked, I've been honest, and I feel like I need to say on here as well, because me and Brian had this conversation at the USCA event. I didn't feel like I had to reiterate what he was saying, because in my mind I knew what he was talking about. But we started talking about AI's role in identifying trends and using it to be more specific for the individual athlete. And it's something that you were kind of touching on, is like what metrics are needed for individuals as opposed to just, hey, we're just doing jump height. Let's see what that comes out of, what output that is, landing mechanics, time to peak acceleration, whatever it is. We can actually just create this formula for our athletes. And again, how that comes about is more so in your raw data, how the Excel comes out of, how you label everything, and then input that into ChatGPT or any other type of AI modeling. And then from there, you can be like, hey, ChatGPT or whatever, what's the trends happening in X metric or KPI or whatever you want. This can help with identifying trends and sort of gauging where everyone is at quicker. But then it does take a lot more work because like you're having to teach a whole model what to do.
It comes down to asking the right questions. So, the example that I'll use, and, related, not related to kind of what you were touching on, is, if I ask ChatGPT, for example, to design a training program to improve, specific lifts, it's going to generate something. And then, it'll potentially ask for further clarification. If you would like this program to be more specific, please provide this information. But again, it comes down to what is actually important. So let's say, for example, that there is a push to be able to move a certain lift faster. Okay? Well, that could mean a number of different things. Is it a technique issue? Is it a force production issue that would, allow us to move faster? And if it is a force production issue, where is that force production issue? Is it braking? Is it propulsion within the specific exercise? So I think to your point, AI can certainly start to learn kind of what we need in terms of that, and potentially help us develop programs in the long term. But the fact of the matter is, they're never going to replace the actual coaching of it as well. Yeah. Because that's the one thing, at least as of now, until we start to develop kind of hologram coaches with AI, we're not going to have that. Trust me, it'll probably happen at some point. We just haven't gotten there yet.
I'll find it because it is in the office. I'll be back in a second. So I lied. I think I took it home to read. But it's essentially a book on how to think and use AI. And one of the best things that it says, and it says this throughout the book, but it's talking about AI lacks the skill to lead, right? So it's great at, rationalizing and generalizing things that it can identify in the internet, but it can't lead, it can't replace the human side of coaching. And I think that's like when I get in conversation with some coaches, again, I used to be like this, where I thought, nah, AI's going to, it can't replace us, it shouldn't use it, whatever else. Like, the more I've looked into it, the more it can take away the menial tasks of a day-to-day runnings. Like, if I don't have time to analyze all my data or the metrics that I want to, hey, ChatGPT, what's this? What's the trends? Mm-hmm. But it can't lead. And it's kind of the same conversation like when we as humans started using computers, people got scared, people wouldn't adopt it, whatever. But then like, when's the last time that you spoke to someone that's never touched a computer? Right. So it's like it's understanding that it's coming whether we like it or not, but like, how can we use it to better deal with what we have to do as coaches?
Yeah, I think if we kind of, take it head on, and rather than just, waiting for it to happen, I think we can actually format it in a way that we would actually be able to benefit from it, rather than kind of beating our heads against a desk and not, like I said, asking the right questions. If we do that up front, then I think everybody wins in that regard. And again, I'll be the first person to admit that I have not been in that literature, in that headspace to kind of investigate kind of which ways and everything that we can go with it. But I know some people are more heavy on it than I have been. But again, as you mentioned, it's coming. It's just a matter of figuring out how do we get it to do what we want it to do earlier versus later.
It's also understanding where it can help and where it shouldn't be Like, if we're talking about research, it's not great because it's going to pull things and make things up. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
been tested and trialed. Like, that's why universities are making such a big push it, because the content isn't original. It's not. It's just things that's taken from different sources, and we don't actually know exactly what sources it can use. Because like it can
Right.
link articles. Like I know for a fact that I've seen some of the articles it pulled from, and it never mentioned anything to do with it. So it's like, okay, then how accurate is this? So like
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, I understand and I agree that it shouldn't be in that space. But in terms of like menial tasks, like it becomes a good product. Now I've kind of gone away from what we originally wanted to talk about. Well, at least I. But you've also just released your book. I knew of this book for a while before you started talking about it. So it's been nice to see the progression and you releasing it. But if you let us know like how it got started and how it's sort of developed from then.
Yeah, so it's funny we were talking about Brian Mann earlier. I was approached. I have to think about this now. Book was released earlier this year, I believe in like March, around the March time, June time, or something around there. Or excuse me, May. That was the date. So it would have been 2 years prior to that. So back in 2023, I was approached by Roger Earl at Human Kinetics to see if I had interest in writing this book, and this was back at the 2023 National Conference for NSCA, and or at least around that time, one of those conferences. I had learned later on that Brian was actually the one who actually recommended me to write this, and forever grateful. I was thankful to actually give Brian a copy of the book. The last conference I saw him at, so thankful for that opportunity. But yeah, over the course of that process, it was essentially, these are the types of things that we want touched on, or that we feel like should be touched on, but feel free to modify as needed. So I ended up coming up with an outline of, at the time, in different chapters before we started to realize that it was actually going to be 12 different chapters due to the specific content that was going to be covered. This isn't meant to be by any means a sequel to Brad Schoenfeld's book that's, Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy, but it's at least in a similar realm where it's focused on a specific topic, in this case strength. After developing the outline, going through and getting kind of that all approved and everything, I wrote those 12 chapters probably in 8-9 months. Some obviously flowed a lot easier than others because I had written similar content previously, but and then after those were all finished, it was kind of sending pieces of it off at a time to be able to get proofread and everything. I went through and checked with a handful of experts in certain areas just to make sure that I was covering the way that that things should be covered. And the example I'll use is the nutrition chapter, in that I went to Dr. Katie Hirsch, who's at the University of South Carolina. Nutrition, I'll be fully honest, is not my strongest aspect or knowledge base within the field. She'd certainly be considered one of the experts, but I told her, I said, I don't want this to be, a strength guy writing a nutrition chapter. I want this to be a good nutrition chapter that focuses on the aspects that can develop strength. So in that regard, went through all that process, and then eventually, I think I submitted everything. It would have been November of, 2024, something along those lines, and then I think the book came out another 6 months or whatever after that. So it was basically a 2-year process, and I'm thankful for it. Certainly had a beverage or two after it was done. I'm just happy that it's out now, and that I'm already thinking about edition 2.
Nice. With the sort of collaboration and touching on points with other coaches, what were some of the biggest takeaways or biggest lessons that you came out with?
Well, I mean, the most humbling thing out of anything is, I'll be the first person to tell you, I learned a lot over the course of this process about some different aspects that I don't necessarily investigate personally all the time. The nutrition side of things, as well as I'll credit Dr. Shona Halson for going through some of the recovery side of things with me. Discussing with different coaches, you really start to understand kind of the specialties that some people have and the knowledge base that they have about certain things. It just gets you thinking a little bit differently, and that was probably the thing that I valued more than anything. I had several conversations about different pieces of this book with Dr. Sophia Nymphius on the motor side of things. The reality is, because we're talking about strength in the context of the ability to produce force, well, obviously when we develop better coordination skills, when we develop the capacity that is maximal force production when it comes to strength characteristics and the ability to be able to express it in different ways, we start to really understand that the different pieces that everyone's talking to are just pieces of the actual puzzle that is the overall product. So I really like to think that this is a resource, that the book itself is a resource for trying to encompass all of that and really focusing on strength as a whole rather than just how much weight we can lift within a certain exercise. So the other thing I'll mention is there's a pretty dense chapter in there that's focused on training methods, and it covers everything from body weight and calisthenic exercises to weightlifting movements to plyos to machines to variable resistance training to sprinting as a training method, change of direction as a training method, blood flow resistance. So there's all these different aspects, and hearing from different coaches, and it's like asking them, like, would you actually use this for this? And if you do, what's your protocol? Like, where did you come up with that? Is it research-based? Is it not research-based? And, is it based on, anecdotal evidence that you did it on yourself type of thing? So those are all the different aspects that I think I learned about throughout the process. But learning how people implement things a little bit differently, I remember having conversations with Danny Lum on some of the isometric stuff, Dr. Chris Tabor, where we talk about accentuated eccentric loading regularly. So there's a lot of people who are still doing some coaching, but are also on the research side that we have these conversations regularly, and which is why we continue to investigate all those different things.
I was going to say welcome to PA Chalk Up, where I constantly get schooled every week.
Yep.
No, but it's very interesting. I think it gets you to look at things differently as well. So recently I've been speaking about taking methods, and it kind of links into something that we spoke about in our last episode, and you presented this idea of having like this graph where there's this curve of like, okay, where does triphasic, where does French contrast, where does XYZ fit into this? And depending on how the athletes are coming in, like how do they fit within this curve, or does the curve change? Or so I think I asked you about this afterwards as well. It's like, how does that then like transfer to? So if we're taking contrast training, and it's a explosive movement followed by some heavy controlled, semi-controlled movement, right? So then can we contrast something else? So like I took a class for one of my friend's gyms, and I contrasted energy systems just to see what would happen. So I sent them on a long run, and then straight after the long run, they did some exercises. After that, they then did short sprints. Like, what happens if we start messing around with energy systems in a contrast style? Like, is there benefits to that? What happens? So it's kind of like going through all of these and seeing how else it could fit in, and maybe change some of what we do as practitioners.
Yeah, I don't want to say strength and conditioning training is trial and error, but oftentimes it is, especially when you're talking about contrast stuff, because having done my dissertation on potentiation complexes, you learn quite a bit about all of the unique things or the number of things that have to go right in order for potentiation to actually occur, or performance enhancement to occur. We published a paper that was on like the deterministic underpinnings of jump potentiation, for example. And, we kind of came up with a figure, and the figure is just kind of a web. There's all these different things that have to go right in order for potentiation to occur. I talk about this with my students regularly, that potentiation complexes in theory make sense, but are they really working in the way that you think they're working? And are they working within the the time context that you're trying to get them to work. Some individuals have taken this so far that they want to implement potentiation complexes within a competition, which is certainly possible with the right individuals and the right circumstances. But at the same time, can we really make the assumption that these are all occurring at optimal every single time? If you actually go through and read that literature, for example, jump performance, there's a couple meta-analyses that'll say, well, peak jump performance occurs between 6 and 8 minutes after, like a squat stimulus. And it's like, cool. I'm not going to have an athlete do a squat and sit down for 6 to 8 minutes and then jump one time. Yeah. So, from a practical standpoint, we just kind of roll our eyes at that, and it's like, sure, it could work, but is it really meaningful to actually do so? And that was one aspect of my dissertation that I tried to focus on, is we did stronger and weaker individuals based on their relative squat strength, and basically determined that the stronger individuals were able to potentiate more and faster compared to the weaker individuals. Mm-hmm. As early as something like 15 seconds after they did something. So the type of protocols that need to be developed are those that actually benefit individuals within a couple minutes. Otherwise, I would make the argument it's probably not even worth it.
I've got a question that I've had this question for a while. You're the right person and the right place to ask.
Maybe.
You for sure are. So when you read research papers and you see elite athletes or athletes, how do you standardize that? Or like, what in terms is an elite athlete? Yeah. Or like, so. Well, I think this question sort of came up because I was reading a research paper. I can't remember which one it was or by who, but they spoke about elite level athletes. But in the sense of performance, as in like days of training, sure, they were training to an elite level, but skill level, they were at like a Bucks 3, which is like miles below any Division 1 or 3, in the US.
No,
so it's like how do we determine what athletes and what stimulus is actually being adapted by these elite performers?
That's the billion-dollar question, probably, because there was a paper that came out a handful of years ago that was talking about how do we classify or identify individuals as elite. Because if we say the term elite, for example, we have, and we're talking about sprinting, who are the elite sprinters? Well, if we talk about the Olympics, you have everyone who lines up on the line within the final you could call elite. Same thing with world championships and things like that. But at the same time, I kind of laugh at anytime I see this in a research paper, will say youth elite athletes. I'm like, how can you even determine that? They may be of the highest quality within the country or the, academy or whatever you may have at the time, but it's all context dependent. So oftentimes when I see the term elite, I usually ask for, or would like to see, some sort of training status or biological status or something like that where we actually know what their training background is. Because if we see youth elite and then they say, well, these were, they've never trained from a weight training standpoint. I'm like, how do you know they're even elite? Like, maybe from a tactical standpoint they might be. But again, in terms of, to your question, kind of how do we identify methods and whatnot in terms of how we would use them with these different individuals, I think it comes down to what are the KPIs that we're actually using for, to show that they're actually improving. So this kind of comes down to the age-old question that, I've touched on, and Manny, we've talked about it before, is how strong is strong enough? And, I get that question regularly with the research that I do. And, you could make the argument that you can never be strong enough. And I mean that in the sense of no athlete will ever tell you, I'm producing too much force, I'm producing it too quickly. Now, there is the context in the sense of, if I continue to gain relative strength, but I'm not improving on the pitch, on the court, or in my actual performances, you could make the argument that the individual is strong enough, or they need a novel training stimulus to get them kind of to that next level, if you will. But we wouldn't know that unless we monitor. So it's all a big puzzle in terms of identifying certain training methods. But coming back to what we talked about before, we train based on theory. It's a lot easier to develop training programs for a group of people rather than individuals. That being said, 80 to 90% of a training program within a team, for example, could be identical, but that 10 to 20% should probably be the stuff that's going to be more individualized. And in my opinion, I don't know that we're really doing that enough in terms of individualization to make sure that each person is actually achieving like an optimal training stimulus.
I once heard a coach say, instead of minimal effective dosage, why don't we look for the optimal effective dosage? And like it's a very small shift, but it's like, and again, it takes more time from us, but again, if you're in this industry, you're kind of, you have to be used to giving more than you can, what's being demanded of you. So it's like, yeah, it takes longer, but the results could be so much better if you just focused on each individual as a sole program, as opposed to a whole bunch of same programs but slightly tailored. And Thomas Newman, when he did the webinar I hosted, he brought up a chart of what he did at Yale, and everyone was pretty much on a different program every single day. And it was like, sure, that was more work for them, but the results were they won everything. So it's like, can you argue with that?
Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, I remember sitting in a presentation, and it was Bob Alejo, Coach Alejo, and one of the things that he was talking about as well was the maximum effective dose. So it's going to be, we call it kind of, this is an overused term within strength and conditioning, but the Goldilocks zone. We understand that there may be a minimal effective dose that may benefit or stimulate a change in adaptation, but the minimal effective dose doesn't necessarily mean it's optimal. That being said, what is the maximum that we would be able to use to maximize the adaptation? Now, is that always appropriate over the course of the training year? Probably not, because we have to manage fatigue and monitor fatigue as much as we can. So to your point, it's probably somewhere in between, where we're going to be benefiting performance, for lack of a better term, optimally within the context of where we are within the season.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think this is things that I'd like to see more, like being spoken about more. But I know most coaches are struggling with the fact that kids aren't turning up. So it's this whole scale of like, can we do all of this? But like, are they coming in for us to do all this? And I think that's one of the hardest things about the industry, because there's so much variance in levels that like you're not truly ever going to find a replicable test all the time. Because like so many factors change every single day. I'm currently reading that. It's by Rick Rubin, The Creative Act, and it's by Rick Rubin, and it talks about how like these ideas work in a wavelength, and like it's our duty to apply them and to test these out and to push for them. But because there's so much change that happens, if we don't act up on something, different noises are going to seep in, and different things are going to happen for us to not be able to. But like, if we speak about in strength and conditioning terms, like not one person is going to come up into the training the same, like you're never going to get the same person every single time. There will be differences.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Tim, I appreciate you so much for coming back on. It's always great to talk to you about research and coaching, well, applicable coaching, I should say, because it is something that sometimes truly frustrates me with research, because like it's a cool concept, but if it takes 6 minutes for us to then jump again, is that doable?
Yeah, and I'll be the first person to do it, and I've told this to my students as well. Is we're going to talk about potentiation complexes and a variety of other things, but the reality is some of the methods that we have in terms of strength and conditioning, potentiation complexes, variable resistance training, accentuated eccentric loading, these may be things that you may never use with your athletes. And the reality is, because there's such a spectrum of abilities and the needs of the individuals, we may not need to use them to actually give them an effective training stimulus. A lot of times going back to the basics and keeping things and doing them savagely well is enough. Until we really need to provide a novel training stimulus where, if we continue to do the same thing that we've done previously, despite tweaks and whatnot, they may just need something new. And in order to adapt, that's what they need.
Yeah, 100%. And it's an individualized approach. And I mean, you've kind of touched on it, but it's like, it's been a generalist. And if my youth program, like, do they need to have all these different stimuluses applied, or can we stick to the fundamentals and build a great base from there? Like, do we need to use chains on them? Probably not. But like, I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's one that I'm constantly like, this is sick, but what's the practicality of it for this specific time?
Right.
Appreciate you, Tim. If you could let people know where they can sort of reach out to you and ask any further questions.
Yeah, sure. I'm on X, Instagram, Dr. T. Suchomel. So if you have any additional questions, happy to answer them. Appreciate that, Manny. Yeah, I mean, that's usually where I'm at. LinkedIn, my information's up there as well. So yeah, anyone can reach out at any time.
Perfect. Look forward to probably seeing you next year as well.
Hopefully, yeah.
Peace.
All right, see ya.